Thank you for joining us here on Polygon's Overview segment. My name's Charlie Hall, and joining me today is Mr. Craig Stern. Hello, Craig.
Hello, Charlie. Thanks for having me.
I invited you on the show to talk about your game, currently available on Steam, called Telepath Tactics. Craig, what can you tell me about this game?
Oh, man. What couldn't I tell you? Well, I couldn't tell you it's a dating sim, because it's not a dating sim. Telepath Tactics is a strategy RPG, so if you've ever played like Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy Tactics, it's a game in that genre. There are not very many games like that for PC, so just the fact that it's that genre alone is kind of a big deal. But it also does some stuff that's pretty unusual for the genre as well, so it kind of stands on its own.
And that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about today. I mean, I've played a bunch of tactical RPGs. Probably one of my favorites. Maybe we can get a little grok nutty here. Really enjoy Fallout Tactics.
Oh,
one of my favorites. That's like way old school, though. But I actually recently just got into Valkyria Chronicles, which is a whole different slice of pie. But you mentioned games like Fire Emblem, and I know that that's been a really popular game recently. So you and I were having a conversation by email, and you actually were telling me a little bit about kind of some of the historical roots for the kind of the background behind the scenes engine running this game, and that's kind of where I wanted to focus our conversation today. So why don't you dial us back here to the year 1810? Is that where we're going to start, Craig?
Close to it. Yeah, it's in the 18 teens. So back in the day, way before there was Dungeons and Dragons, and way before there were the Plato mainframes with their games trying to emulate Dungeons and Dragons, way before Wizardry came along and introduced the computer RPG to Japan, and way before 1987 when Fire Emblem was conceived over in Japan, there were war games.
Now we're talking war games, right? These are generals sitting in the war room playing very sophisticated games about like the next war.
That is how they started, yeah. And the very first one, it's called Kriegspiel, was conceived in Prussia in the 18 teens by this guy named Baron von Reiswitz. So the way he went about it was he created units for the game that were actually in use by the major military forces in the 18 teens. And this wasn't really meant to be like a game you would play for fun. This was meant to accurately simulate battles with units that accurately, that were kind of like accurate facsimiles of actual military units.
Right, so like the Prussian army is so many brigades of cavalry and so many companies of infantry, and he would have each of them modeled there by his staff.
Precisely. And what he would do, once he created the battlefield and he had the units, and there was an actual like physical battlefield that he modeled, and he had pieces representing each of the units, and he would then use dice to simulate unforeseen factors in resolving the combat between these different military units on the battlefield. That was how it started, right? This was this guy's creation in the 18 teens. It took a little while, like over a decade, before it really caught on, though. His son, von Reiswitz's son, actually created a revised version of the game in the 1820s. And that one was deemed so accurate that the chief of the Prussian General Staff recommended the game as a military exercise to the King of Prussia, who then ordered every regiment in the Prussian army to have a copy of it. It didn't stop with the revised version of the 1820s. There's actually a third version of Kriegspiel that was put out in 1876 by, and this guy's name is a mouthful, I'm going to do my best to not screw it up, by a guy named Colonel Julius Adrian Friedrich Wilhelm von Verdi du Vernois.
Holy cow. Okay.
That's that guy's name. I'm just going to call him Verdi du Vernois.
All right, so Verdi did a thing. What thing did Verdi do?
Verdi du Vernois, also a Prussian military man, 1876, he comes out with his own version. He was suspicious of the idea that you could use dice to determine military outcomes. So
He sounds like he would probably really enjoy German board games.
I'm sure he would. I'm sure he would. He's from the right region of the world. But yeah, he just didn't like the... He actually wrote... There's actually a book that this guy, Verdi du Vernois, wrote called Studies in Troop Leading. And you can actually find this on Google Books. It's a free ebook where he talks about just all of his thoughts on like tactics and basically all the considerations that were kind of going through his mind when he was revising this game. So he was deeply suspicious of the idea that you could use dice to accurately determine military outcomes. And given that the whole point of this game, at least at the time, was fidelity and accuracy, he decided that it would be best to replace dice with fixed rules and impartial umpires who would determine the outcomes of various engagements based on their knowledge and experience. So
this is like a panel of experts that sits in front of the gamers themselves and kind of arbitrates the battle as it goes on.
It's, probably the closest analog is really just a dungeon master, right? There's a dungeon master who's sitting there DMing the battle, saying what happens. And funnily enough, these war games eventually evolved into Dungeons and Dragons, right? They're the ancestors of Dungeons and Dragons, and therefore of all RPGs. So you have the, deep in the past of all role-playing games, you have this fundamental conflict between using dice to resolve combat and using fixed rules and sort of knowledge and experience to handle it in a way that is non-random.
So, these are the antecedents to things like modern military war games, to things like modern military simulation games. All right, so how does Telepath Tactics split the pie?
The way Telepath Tactics splits the pie is it mostly opts for the Verdi du Vernois approach. Not in that there's a human umpire sitting in your computer, but in that there are fixed rules and they operate deterministically. The game is very, very much it very much eschews the notion of using die rolls to determine the outcomes of various actions.
So you walk your cavalry unit up to Unit X and you get behind it and you perform a backstab, and 99 times out of 10 it's going to have the same outcome.
No, 100 times out of 100 it's going to have the same outcome. The only time there are a few things that I put in the game just to increase the possibility space a little bit more. There are a few things in the game where randomness can have an effect, but under normal conditions, it's 100% predictable and deterministic.
So what does that mean for the player? How does that change the game versus something like a Fire Emblem?
It does a lot of different things. The first thing it does, right, is it changes the nature of the kind of problems the player is tasked with solving. In Fire Emblem, by and large, you're dealing with an extremely predictable AI, and the main source of the unpredictability in the game is how the die rolls are going to resolve the actions you've chosen to take, right? You're essentially gambling. You're making calculated risks, and it's well done, right? The game does a good job of presenting to you the probabilities of various actions and the likely consequences of your actions, so you're able to make informed decisions. And it's a very good game doing what it does, but it's not the same thing as what Telepath Tactics does. What Telepath Tactics does is it instead of having you sitting around trying to think about, man, is this attack going to work? Is it not going to work? You know if it's going to work. What you don't know is what the enemy is going to do. So the uncertainty in this game is instead of relying on the die rolls, the uncertainty is generated by an unpredictable opponent in combination with a large set of possible moves that they could take in order to try to defeat you.
All right, let me break this down. I've got a particular scenario. This is a scenario that I was playing earlier this afternoon, and this is one of probably the second or third large battles that you're going to get in to with the main campaign in Telepath Tactics. So I'm trying to rescue somebody that's on the top of this mound here. What I've done is I've moved kind of the bulk of my forces into this little copse of trees here, and I'm going to try and use my cavalry unit over here, which is oddly enough riding a bug, and he's going to run over there, and he's going to try and bring the enemy towards this little ambush that I've set up. I've got a little snare trap. I've got a guy over here with an axe covering the left flank. I've got my archers in the back and my telepaths ready to provide support. And so I'm waiting to draw the enemy in. And honestly, in just about any other little tactical skirmish game that I would play, that would work. But I was really impressed. I played through this scenario about 3 or 4 times, and I tried to do something similar to this. They reacted somewhat differently every time. In this particular scenario, they came up and they straight up assaulted my cavalry unit and didn't allow it time to retreat. He had to retreat in a different avenue than he wanted to, which caused the enemy infantry to advance along a different avenue, not directly involving itself in the ambush that I had laid. Your AI is pretty smart, Craig.
Thanks. I was really trying to go for that. That is, I think, one of the weaknesses of games like Fire Emblem, which, by the way, I love Fire Emblem, so don't think I'm smack-talking it here. But one of the weaknesses of it is the way the AI works for the most part. You're sort of tasked with aggroing individual enemies one by one, making them break away from the enemy force, and, just sort of then playing a sort of rock, paper, scissors with them to try to defeat the enemy in the most efficient way possible. In this game, I really went out of my way to avoid that. Even in battles like this, where there is a largely passive enemy force, enemies nonetheless get triggered in groups, so you're never able to just comfortably deal with the enemy one by one. You instead have to deal with quite a few opponents all at once. And as you mentioned, the AI can be unpredictable. It tends to shift the order in which it moves units, and each unit has its own priorities, so that in turn has a sort of cascade effect, and the enemy just never does the same thing twice.
So tell me a little bit about the number of units and the kind of diversity of their move sets.
Sure. In the single-player campaign, there are 27 unique recruitable characters. Characters in this game are drawn from a pool of 23 base character classes, which, if you've never played a strategy RPG, just take my word for it, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that's quite a lot. So you have characters that are there are a few classes that are like frontline fighters, and they all have their own sort of specialties. So, for instance, you have the swordsmen. They, by and large, are focused on having a lot of counterattacks. They have a feint ability that they learn that they can use to strip enemies of counterattacks, so they can attack with impunity. And by and large, they tend to be relatively fast-moving. They can sprint to get extra range. You've got your axe wielders. They have access to throwing axes, which are somewhat inaccurate, but which can hit from far away. And they eventually learn to soften enemy armor with armor rend. I'm not going to go through every single melee class, but there's that kind of diversity. Like they each learn their own skill sets. You've got your ranged units. Bowmen eventually gain access to an ability called Arced Shot that can be used kind of like artillery. It can hit from very far away, but it's somewhat inaccurate. Their base attack, they can like shoot an arrow and keep moving, so they're good as harassment units. And then you've got your crossbowmen, who are hardier. They can get in closer. They have fewer options as far as really long range attacks, but they are much more effective in sort of like close to medium range. And they also gain access to an ability called Powder Bolt, which can be used to destroy scenery. So they can blow up bridges, bust through barricades, and they can also instantly detonate explosive charges, which destroy pretty much every destructible object within range. So you got those guys. Then you've got, there are a couple of flying units in the game, the Spurgits and the Shadowlings. Spurgits have breath attacks and can hit multiple characters in a row. Shadowlings can teleport and tend to have advanced mental abilities. You've got your Licit. They're the lizard people in the game. They tend to have a dodge percentage, which is rare because, determinism, but they are one of two classes in the game that actually can dodge attacks. It's one of their special abilities. And they have a lot of status effect inducing attacks with their maces, or barud, as they call them. There are assassins that can leap over enemies, mentalists that can push and pull enemies at a distance, throwing them into the lava. You've got stone golems that can pick up characters and throw them, bronze golems that have spin saws that can hack through up to 3 enemies in an arc. There's a huge variety of different units and tactics you can use with them.
That's rad. It's also got a hot seat multiplayer as well, I believe.
Yes.
But I was also really pleased with kind of the depth of the writing and the story-driven nature of the single-player campaign. What can you tell me about kind of where the inspiration for that campaign came from?
Sure. The campaign actually takes place in a setting that I've been using for a few games now. I just call it the Telepath universe. Previous games in the series have taken place on a continent called Cerebella. This particular game takes place in an area I haven't covered yet in the series. It's a giant archipelago spanning thousands of islands that just span hundreds and hundreds of miles south of Cerebella. And it's known as the Dundar Archipelago. It's presided over by an empire known as the Dundar Empire. They have a hell of a time actually trying to rule the thing because there's just so many different cultures that are separated by ocean. It's just very difficult for them to keep a hold on things, and stuff can go on that's not super cool. One thing that happens in this game, there's a race called the Shadowlings. They are a subterranean race of creatures. They're basically like disembodied heads and hands that float around and trail smoke, and they're psychic creatures. They actually feed off of the negative emotions of other sentient creatures, and historically they've viewed humans as prey. These guys, the Shadowlings, are very adept at mining vibra. Vibra is kind of like this world's analog to coal, and it's used to power steam technology. So they've taken to enslaving people and using them to mine vibra in the Isles. The Isles happen to be very rich in vibra, so that's where they're doing it, and they are in turn sort of bribing officials in the Dundar government to let them have their way with the human populace. And that money in turn is used to finance elections, which are really expensive. There's this whole complicated political web in the game with the various races and how they interact, and it sort of forms the core of the story. It's never like really overtly stated, but because I want the game to be engaging, and I want it to be something where like people can easily relate to the characters, and it's not just all dry exposition and lore. But the background is there if you care to dig into it.
Well, I've really enjoyed the couple of days that I've spent with, and I really appreciate you getting on the line here and taking a little deeper dive than most folks might even notice when they pick up the game. So I wish you a lot of luck, and thanks again for the time.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Charlie. It was nice talking to you.